This presentation is part of the academic webinar series of the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict. To view a full catalog of our past webinars and for a schedule of our upcoming presentations, please visit nonviolent-conflict.org and click on the button labeled Learning and Resources.
My name is Jake Fitzpatrick, and I'm the Content Development Associate at ICNC. And today's webinar is titled Strategic Nonviolent Struggle in the Middle East Before the Arab Spring, and will be delivered by Dr. Benedetta Berti, Associate Fellow and Lecturer at Tel Aviv University. Dr. Benedetta Berti is a Research Fellow at the Institute for National Security Studies, a young Atlanticist in the Atlantic Council, and a member of the faculty at Tel Aviv University. She also works as security and policy consultant for political risk consulting firms, international organizations, as well as foreign embassies. Before joining INSS, Dr. Berti worked in NGOs and research institutes in Latin America, the Middle East, and the US, focusing on human rights, internal conflict, and political violence. She was a lecturer and researcher at Tufts and Harvard Universities, a legislative and policy assistant on Capitol Hill, and a fellow at the Reut Institute. Her research is related to political violence and conflict in the Middle East, as well as social movements theory and strategic nonviolence. She focuses specifically on political integration of armed groups, democratization, SSR, and rule of law. Dr. Berti has written extensively on political participation of armed groups, human rights, and Middle Eastern politics. She has authored 2 forthcoming books on these subjects with Johns Hopkins University Press, and regularly publishes book chapters and articles in journals, edited volumes, and policy publications. In addition, she collaborates with publications like the Christian Science Monitor. Dr. Berti holds a PhD and an MA in International Relations and Security Studies from the Fletcher School at Tufts University, and a BA in Middle Eastern Studies from Bologna University. And for those of you on Twitter, you can follow her. It's at Benedetta Berti W. And with that, I will hand it over to our presenter.
Thank you, Jake. Okay, so without further ado, let me get started. As Jake stated in the presentation, I come at looking at the question of strategic of struggle in civil society from a point of view of political scientists. For a few years, I've been looking at the process of political integration of armed groups into the political system and their interaction with civil society and their adoption of civil society tools of struggle is one of the questions that really interests me. I started working on this topic working on Latin and Central America, and for the past few years I've actually been interested in this other part of the world, in the Middle East. And with that in mind, when the so-called Arab Spring, Arab Awakening, there's a gazillion definitions out there. Well, when it started, I have been working for a little while on the question of strategic nonviolence in civil society, and that's really what I will try to do today, to kind of give a little bit of the background, what was happening before this sudden explosion of social and political mobilization that we call the Arab Spring. And I come through this question because one of the things that I found to be particularly interesting is that when the popular mobilizations began, when the so-called Arab Spring began, first in Tunisia and then in Egypt, one of the messages we could see by following the coverage of the events from the Western media was that there was this sudden eruption of civil society, and in a way it was portrayed as if before this Arab Spring civil society was absent, civil society was passive, the population was dormant. The coverage carried all these sort of assumptions about the fact that all of a sudden there is this rupture, this watershed, and people take the streets, but before really people were not active and engaged. And I argue that that's actually not the right way to look at the social and political mobilization, but there is, I think, a deeper analysis of the question, looks at least 2 decades backwards and actually sees how social mobilization kept building up leading to this rupture that we call the Arab Spring. So that's what I want to do today, and in about 30 minutes. I hope we'll have time to cover everything. To begin, I need to move forward. There you go. I want to start by addressing this issue that I just raised. The fact that when the Arab Spring began, when we had this massive social political mobilization taking the streets, virtually in every country, one way or another in the Middle East, there was a bit of a shock. There was a bit of a shock coming from the international community, and there was this sense of surprise because we didn't see it coming, basically. And on the one hand, there's pretty strong reasons why we didn't see it coming, from the fact that we didn't have all the data we needed, to the fact that modeling and predicting revolution is sort of the holy grail of political science. It is very hard to do. And to the really obvious but important fact that the Middle East and North Africa region is extremely broad, extremely diverse, extremely complex. You're putting together countries with such different socioeconomic development rates with different populations. So in other words, it's a very rich and diverse region and pluralist, and as such to kind of draw one broad trend is very hard to do. And that's certainly true. But one of the problems, I think, that prevented us from foreseeing this Arab Spring and this awakening, this dramatic challenging of the status quo, was that a lot of the studies on this region in the past few years focused on the stability of the system rather than the cracks that were actually there. In a way, there was this predicament, this assumption that stability breeds stability, that the persistence of undemocratic ruling is sort of an inherent, almost embedded feature in this region. And in a way, for people that were looking at this region, they were seeing that persistence of undemocratic rulers was the norm rather than the exceptions. Looking at the Middle East in 2010, one would have seen Gaddafi in power from 1967, Assad in power in Syria from the 70s, Saleh in Yemen from 78, Ben Ali in Tunisia in power from 1987, Mubarak was in power in Egypt from 1981. There was this persistence of undemocratic rulers. And there was this focus on the regime security and on describing the system as inherently stable. You see a state that is very big, controls the economy, controls the public space, and basically deals with protests through a combination of repression and bribes. Repression by creating a culture of fear, by focusing its military on internal defense, which is a code word for protecting the regime from the people. And when fear or repression didn't work, there was also a system of cooptation, patronage, clientelism, deep control of the economy. So in a way, through this combination of controlling and bribing social dissent, and this divide and rule policy and this differentiated access to citizenship and all these tools put together, the analysis was the regime is safe, the regime is secure, the regime is stable. However, if instead of looking at the persistence of undemocratic rulers in the Middle East through this lens of regime security, we would have looked at human security, then we would have seen that stability was really not what the region was about. I'm just going to make one example because then I want to move to civil society. But if we look at the UNDP Human Development Reports from 2002 to 2009, the point that they make is very clear. The region may look stable if you only look at the regime, but if you look at the people and their personal security and the challenges to their livelihood, political, economical, cultural, environmental, if you put all these things together, then you have a picture where the region is extremely unstable from a human security point of view. So just by turning the tables and looking at the population and the society as opposed to the regime, you already can see the first cracks that were the cracks that eventually led to this change of the status quo. And also, the problem looking only at the regime and regime stability is that it led to this assumption that there was no civil society, or that the civil society was not organized, or the civil society was not engaged in any meaningful act of resistance to the regime. And my point is that perhaps the civil society, the point I would make through the presentation is, perhaps civil society was not engaged in what a standard Western definition of political challenge of the regime is, but the civil society was creating an alternative reality through community empowerment actions that pretty much represented a challenge to the regime. So it's not true that the society was absent. So with that in mind, I want to say a few words about what is civil society in the Middle East. And here, the first question that I put in my presentation is, when do we even begin to talk and to think about civil society? And I don't want to go too much academic, but I'll just throw out a couple of points about the definition, the terminology, and why it can be problematic in this context. First of all, the first modern studies of civil society in the Middle East, you start having them in the early 90s. This is not a particular surprise. The early 90s are basically a time in which Western scholars focus on the effects, the demonstration effect of 1989 in Eastern Europe. They start looking around the world and seeing in which other parts of the world this democratization process may take place next. If you were to do a literature review of this period, you would see a number of articles talking about the Arab world would be next, talking about the development of social organizations, NGOs in the Middle East as a sign of a developing, thriving, not thriving, but trying to emerge civil society, and they were using kind of these indicators to think about whether the Arab world and the Middle East in general would be next. So the first studies focus on understanding what the civil society looks like. So there are studies of the women's group, professional organization, unions, NGOs, all the groups we'll talk about in a minute. However, the interest in this process basically starts to fade by the end of the 90s, and this explains also why when the Arab Spring comes about, there were all but a few people who had continued to follow up and to really monitor civil society in the Middle East. One of the problems with looking at civil society in the Middle East, of course, has to do with the definition of civil society. And before I move forward and talk about what the civil society looks like, what it looked like when it started to really develop in the late 80s, early 90s, the first problem that we have is how to define it. As you know, by studying civil society literature, there's a gazillion definitions out there of what civil society means. But if we take the original, the Tocqueville definition of civil society, and we try to apply it to the Middle East, we already see there are a few problems. The definition per se doesn't completely match. What do I mean? Originally defined as the creation of civil networks among citizens to foster tolerance and civility. There's a lot of assumptions behind this definition. One of the assumptions is that the state acts as an enabler, as a referee of the civil society, and that the civil society is made of free citizens that create this intermediate space between the private sector and the state. And in a way, their interactions just strengthen the state and its values, the state in this case being intended as a democracy. Already when we apply this kind of definition to countries where there is no democracy, there is an autocratic ruling, we already seen there is a mismatch. The second problem is when we think about civil society, we associate it with the idea of civitas, citizen, the citizen. So the citizen is the subject, the main actor of the civil society. It's a member of a political community, and basically by citizens coming together, they create a form of collective political mobilization. So these are already two big problems. The first problem is talking about civil society where there's the state acting as a referee doesn't apply to this part of the world, didn't apply certainly in the authoritarian regimes that were the norm, rather the exception in the region. And secondly, whereas there was a plurality of civil organizations, most of them did not respond to this definition in the Middle East because historically they were less geared towards this political mobilization focused on this question of citizen. It was much more focused on the charity level, the philanthropy level, the community empowerment level, which arguably have political functions, but different from the traditional definition of civil society as we have it according to this standard, traditional, orthodox Western definition. A better way to look at civil society in the Middle East is by looking at civil society as the counterweight to the state. So not so much working with the state as a referee, but in a way working to defend people from against authoritarian ruling. And that was certainly a function a function of civil society, and this certainly is a function of civil society that does apply to this part of the world, looking at the groups that work outside the state to express the interest of different social groups, and they do not coincide with extension of family, tribal, clans, or other traditional forms of social interactions. So if we take the standard definition and we tweak it around a bit, then we can already see that it can definitely apply to the region. And an interesting point I want to raise is in the mid-90s there was a non-profit survey that interviewed a large number of people involved in NGO in the Middle East and kind of pulled together their definition of civil society. And whereas they could come up with a very operational definition, they basically deconstructed into what are the main elements that people in the Middle East, as in the mid-90s, saw as essential to have a thriving civil society. And these are to have active individuals that have freedom of action, that act independently from the state on a volunteer or non-profit basis, that have internally within the organization good governance and transparency, and they have achieved some level of legal recognition. They work separately from the state, but they are able to create for themselves a regulated presence within the polity. So these were kind of the elements that they mentioned as important to our civil society. And one of the first points that you will immediately get to by looking at this list is that to achieve this status, to have a thriving civil society, to have a group that manages to be active, to be organized, to have a social structure, to act on a non-profit basis, to achieve general social and public aims, to have internal good governance, to protect freedom, and to be separated and distinct from the government, that's a very daunting task given the level of obstacles that civil society development faces in the Middle East. And some of them are still pretty much relevant, but as for the presentation, this refers to the late 80s, early 90s. And here we can see that the obstacles are wide and broad and basically come from all different levels of society, from the economic to the political to the internal legal processes to the historical and cultural. And very briefly, because we don't have that much time, so very briefly I've skimmed through this. Development of civil society in the Middle East was extremely hard because of the economic context. You had a state that was very big and regulated the economy with a very strong, omnipresent bureaucratic apparatus, sort of a big brother. The space not controlled by the state was fairly small. There was also a fairly weak middle class, which is pointed out by a number of authors on civil society as one of the early important links to develop the civil society. So you have an extremely regulated economy, very weak middle class. On top of that, you have an extremely militarized culture within the state, with the military basically working to protect the state from the people and to preserve these walls of fears around the regime. Politically speaking, the state doesn't really act as a referee in civil society. The state acts as a policeman trying to crush any sort of political dissent early on. The state is extremely centralized, and it's also a state that has created a weak link between the citizen and the state through an unequal access to citizenship and citizenship rights. On top of this, as if it was not enough, you also had very serious legal obstacles. Again, a survey of regulation of NGOs and civil society organizations during the 90s finds that basically in the Middle East you have three types of regimes. Regimes where there is basically no law because no independent civil society is allowed. On the other hand, there are countries like Egypt that have very restrictive laws in which the Ministry of Social Affairs regulates, gives permits to civil society organizations to be created, and even after that has pretty much a very strong say in what the organization can do. It can send people from the ministry to check out their board meetings to make sure that nothing gets too political. So there's a very strong interference into the public sphere by the state. Or there are countries that have fairly good laws in theory, but very, very poor implementation. And on top of this, you also have a state which feels very skeptical, very reluctant to accept independent civil society organizations, and tries to co-opt them, co-opt NGOs who create its own government, non-governmental organizations, which in a way act as a fig leaf for the regime. So when you put all these things together, you have massive obstacles to the development of the civil society. But that doesn't mean that you didn't have a civil society, which will be my next point. You did have a civil society. It's a civil society that by and large looked less organized around political mobilization and more organized about social, cultural, and economic mobilization. It's a civil society where you find a place for NGOs, especially after the 90s. There is an extreme, pretty rapid rise in the number of NGOs in virtually every country in the region. In certain countries, they like Egypt, they basically almost double within 2 decades. So there is a very much rise in the number of NGOs. On top of that, you have professional organization. Professional organization would actually be the first civil society organization historically in this part of the world, and they continue to play a very important role. If we get time to talk about the Arab Spring per se, we'll see the professional associations like the Bar Association in Tunisia played an important role in directing the strategic nonviolent struggle. So you have NGO, professional organization, unions. I'll talk about them in a minute. And then you have Islamist movements that are built around the concept of strengthening social solidarity. They foster a competition with the state over the provision of social and political goods, but mostly social goods and philanthropy. So it is a civil society, it's there, it creates a space between the state and the market, but it's far more focused on civil, cultural, economic, and charity activities, and it's also focused on community empowerment projects, which I'll talk about in a second. It's also a civil society that looks a little bit more complex than the one we would have in Western countries, because it mixes with traditional societies and with community organizations. So in that sense, it's more complex and more layered, but it doesn't mean that it's not there. It's also a civil society that is not located in the public sphere, in the political public sphere, because the political public sphere is pretty much shut down, over-regulated, and the state is basically taking over that space. So the civil society develops in alternative places, in cultural organizations, in universities, within professional associations, headquarters, within unions, within mosques. It develops in different places, sort of multiplying the places of resistance within a given society. So this idea that there is a vacuum is absolutely not fitting to the reality. And especially from the beginning of the 90s, you definitely see a proliferation and a high number of increase of this type of organizations, spurred by growing flows of cash flows into this part of the world, global communication, and the demonstration effect from the political changes and the democratization processes in Eastern Europe. So all these things basically create an incentive to the creation of alternative civil society organizations. Civil strategic nonviolent struggle also gets pretty much boosted in this part of the world after the first Intifada, with Palestine becoming a really important model of peaceful strategic nonviolent resistance, which is what the first Intifada largely was at the beginning. Definitely in the early stages, as such, it can be a model for the region. But there are also other reasons why the mid to late 80s and early 90s saw a rise of civil society in this part of the world. And the reason is because These are also the years where economic liberalization is pushed through the region. The sort of structural readjustment programs that are pushed by Western donors and the IMF and the like come to this part of the world in this period, and they create a very interesting dynamic. The interesting dynamic is the state starts to partially go through this liberalization. In a way, part of the economy is privatized. The public sector shrinks. The number of people on the government payroll is reduced, and in a way, there is a retreat. The state that was previously everywhere, controlling the economy and controlling and buying off loyalty to this clientelist patronage system, is somewhat undermined from within with these liberalization processes, because on the one hand the state retreats, it shrinks in terms of size and in terms of the people that are on its payroll. At the same time, the state also sees this combination of liberalization without the creation of a strong social system creates growing inequality, growing unemployment, and basically this triggers two main processes. The one process is it triggers social economic grievances within the population, and on the other hand, this is why you have the rise of civil society and public demonstrations. You don't just have the reason, the heightened grievances, but you also have a state that shrinks, and with that it gives a little bit more room for civil society to breathe and to develop and for middle class to emerge. And therefore, it's kind of, in a way, ironic that this economic liberalization that this regime were pushing to stay in power, in a way, did undermine their control of the state and created this first seeds of civil society development. And therefore, if you look at the Middle East in the early 90s, and you can in the 80s and 90s, with the liberalization process kicking in, you see a rise in the number of civil society organizations, as I already said, and you also see a rise in the number of public demonstrations. The 80s are the years of the first large-scale, massive protest, the cycle of protests called the bread riots. You have massive protest, urban protests in Morocco in '83 over the state's reduction of subsidies. In '84, the protests kick in Tunisia. By '87, you have similar kind of social economic mobilizations in Lebanon. In '88, the same happens in Algeria. In '89, in Jordan. Jordan is a specific case because in addition to the economic mobilizations, when the Gulf War kicks in, you also have political mobilization, which is the exception at this stage. And then 91 and 92, again, the cycle of protest over social economic grievances kicking in Iran. So basically, you can see how far from being completely quiet and dormant, the society was pretty much questioning the status quo, but the protests were largely spontaneous, without some substantial long-term planning, mostly urban, and most importantly, they didn't have a wide political platform demanding wide political change and a change of the regime. But they started to question certain policies within the regime. A particularly important role in this type of mobilizations will be played at the same time by unions. Unions that on the one hand in most of these countries were unitary, compulsory, and co-opted by the state, so had very little leverage politically, but yes, had leverage on the economy, and yes, participated in this kind of social economic mobilizations, which fostered this idea of a civil society that was active. The other type of social society, non-violent mobilization that I think it's very important to talk about because it's often neglected is the invisible type, I would call it, of social political mobilization, which is the community building. This is something that really happens. The community activism really picks up with in the late 80s, early 90s. On the one hand, because of this process of liberalization, because the rising inequalities, you have very skewed dysfunctional economic system where you see the GDP going up, but also the level of inequality and the living standards of the people going down. So really, inequality is a very big factor. And therefore, in this kind of context, you start seeing the rise of community-based activism. This community-based activism was often located in the poorest, most marginalized, most deprived neighborhoods, and in a way they constituted early examples of micro-rebellion. You know, what am I talking about here? Here we're talking about local communities self-organizing, claiming territory, claiming infrastructure from the state that was obviously not there, obviously not responding to their needs, and self-organizing, self-ruling their own areas and creating a sort of a parallel alternative governance, mini-government structure or mini community-based provision of social and economical services. In a way, this is contentious politics. It's not contentious politics with capital P in politics, because it doesn't directly challenge the regime in a frontal way, but it's yes political because it produces a new reality which is aimed at this collective consumption, which is aimed at this community empowerment, and it basically builds on community, family, tribal, clan, pre-existing traditional structures, and it builds on that, creating civic networks. But so looking a little bit different from our traditional civil society again, but yes, it's important. This quiet encroachment type of activism is, I argue, very much important. It goes against the anti-Thomization discourse of the state. It goes from demands towards the state to claims, claiming the area, claiming their own life, ultimately expanding the range of freedoms allowed to the citizens, expanding the living condition, redistribution of public goods, creating an alternative narrative to the government.
Benedetta, are you there?
And also it's alternative system that fosters the community.
Benedetta, can I stop you for 1 second? You just blanked out. Okay, you blanked out for about 20 seconds, so if you could just go back to your last point.
Oh, absolutely. What was I saying? In my last point, I think I was pretty much summing up by saying that this type of community-based activism was yes, a form of strategic or violent struggle, because it was, yes, creating a separate reality from the dominant, all-encompassing, omnipresent narrative of the state. And it was creating these early networks between citizens that would then become important to foster social solidarity and also to basically expand the freedom allowed to the citizens and create these alternative models. And so, in a way, they were the precursors, part of the precursors to what happened later, which was the frontal challenging of the system through big politics, through mass mobilization, the shifting from the socioeconomics to the political demands. But to do that, you have to have to get to this Arab Spring mass mobilization focused around political demands, which start very much embedded with the socioeconomics, of course. But together, you have to have a couple of decades with broad economic mobilization, the rise in the number and the activism and the capabilities of the civil society through the rising of the number of NGOs, the development of Islamist organizations to the provision of social services and their more active role in the polity, and the community-based activism and the quiet encroachment, which was quietly trying to undermine the system from the top down, to undermine authoritarianism from the top down by just creating on the ground a different reality. So when you have all these things together, then the Arab Spring makes a little bit more sense, I think, than when you follow the mainstream media understanding of these events, as this spontaneous, unplanned mobilization that did not build on anything that was there before. My simple point that I was trying to make in the past 30 minutes is that it was a lot happening before. It was a lot. Most of it was under the water. We couldn't see it very clearly without going and looking at the micro level, but it was there. And it was very much important, and it will be one of the experiences upon which this mobilization over the past couple of years has drawn upon. And I don't want to say anything more because I want to leave some time for questions.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Benedetta, for your presentation. We do have a few people who've already sent in some questions, but if you have any other ones, again, you can either use a microphone and click the raise hand button on your toolbar, and then I can call on you, or the alternative option is to type in your question into the questions pane that you'll see on your toolbar as well. So it looks like we do have a couple hands up. I'm going to start with Katrian. So Katrian, please go ahead.
Okay, sorry, I was preparing myself. I would like to know a little bit more about strategic nonviolence, how it developed, or how is your understanding of how it developed before the Arab Spring, actually?
Okay. Yes, I can answer. Okay. Well, so all this type of activism that I was talking about is fundamentally it's of course fundamentally nonviolent. If you look at the civil activism and the provision of social services through Islamist networks, to welfare-based network, all that is clearly nonviolent. When we get to the community-based empowerment, so the quiet encroachment sort of activism, and here is basically people reclaiming space from the state. What does it mean? It means part of the big capitals that's been neglected, the rundown clinic gets taken over by the people in the neighborhood and just transform it and make it work. That's also nonviolent fundamentally. Where we get a little bit more, let's say, in a liminal area between violence and non-violence is when we look at the first mobilization of the 80s, just the first big cycle that was the bread riots, this first regional type of mass mobilization. And here, I mean, the violence, non-violence is a matter of definition to a large extent, but here you have mobilization that are largely non-violent when it comes to, if you use as a standard, direct confrontation. So it was no urban guerrilla, that it had episodes of lootings and riots. So there was violence against property rather than against people. So I would make the distinction. And one of the examples that I was given that I don't have time to talk about it, I didn't have time to talk about it, but I think one of the first big examples that had very important regional implication is the model of Palestine and the model of the first Intifada, which started as a spontaneous challenge into the occupation through protests that were largely strategic nonviolence. And here you're talking about mass mobilization, non-cooperation, strikes. All the tools in the toolbox were used at the beginning. And then, of course, it becomes a little bit more mixed as the protests go forward. But the model of the first Intifada, I think, has a very strong impact on what strategic nonviolence can look like.
Our next question comes from Grace, who is calling in. Grace, can you please go ahead?
Hello, do you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, I'm just wondering, can you talk a bit more about the use of new media such as Facebook? Tego mentioned a lot of factors that are leading to the Arab Spring.
Yeah. Then we get a little bit, our time frame gets a little bit more forward in terms of social media because we get a little bit more in the period already in the early 2000s. But yes, I can talk about it as digital activism and cyber activism has played a very important, I would say a pretty important role in organizing both in organizing the protests that led to the Arab Spring in both Tunisia and Egypt, where you have a society that is highly present on Twitter and on Facebook, and they were using, even this is before the mobilization, you had some of the important groups that called to the mobilization that were organized through Facebook, and through Facebook they were able to coordinate, to decide how to meet, what sort of activism to implement. But even before the active mobilization, this was a place for meeting, this was a place to coordinate, to access strength, to access information, to disseminate their narrative, and to do counter-information. So all these things were very important. To build social solidarity. So I would say the social media played a very important part in Tunisia. It played an important part in Egypt. If we look a few years back, it played a quite important part for the Green Revolution as well in Iran. However, it's a very new topic, and we don't have a lot of empirical data that allows us to have, in my opinion at least, very strong causation. I would say these media and these tools more as an enabler than a cause. I would put that as a caveat. And also I would raise a word of caution against the potential drawbacks and the potential effects that is, as much as these are very important tools for civil society to organize, the counter-argument to that is they're also tools that the government can infiltrate and control and use to crack down on civil society organizations. So it works both ways. And both in the case of Iran and also in the case of Egypt, one of the interesting points raised is that it was when the regime cracked down on the social medias and on the internet that a lot of people actually went on the street. So not to diminish the impact of social media, because I think it did have a strong impact. It raised the attention, creating a network with the world. It also was important in the Arab Spring to create a sort of bridge and communication between the different countries and to foster this rising regional identity around the protest. But I wouldn't overemphasize its importance, because at the end of the day, it was more an enabler, I would say, than a cause of the revolutions.
Okay, we do have a few more hands that are raised, but I'm going to switch gears just for a question to the written questions. This one comes from Bobby, and Bobby asks, can you please comment on the role of the Muslim Brotherhood in developing a civil society and also in generating the Arab Spring?
Yeah. Okay, so I briefly, very briefly touched upon it when I said that the role of Islamist organizations, and that I think that should be emphasized. These are organizations that work from the bottom-up sort of community development. The idea of development carried by this organization is mixed. On the one hand, there is the assistentialism and the providing the goods and be reactive, but on the other hand, the idea of fostering social solidarity is also built around this idea of community empowerment and getting people involved on a direct basis, which is very important, because whereas the first type of activism, just providing services and treating the population as a beneficiary, doesn't necessarily develop the kind of structure that you need to have an active civil society, but the second type of development, the ones that sees citizens empowerment, then that is very important to develop civil society. And I think in general, Islamist organizations had that in them. That said, of course, if we take this a step further, we want to pinpoint the role of groups like, let's say, Muslim Brotherhood inspired in creating the Arab Spring. Then I would think that my answer will be, it actually depends a lot on which countries we're talking about. In a country, for example, like Tunisia, the Islamist sector was overregulated by the very authoritarian regime that was in place with Ben Ali. It was there, but it was very difficult for it to have an active role, because it was pretty much again hyper-regulating, and not as all its main leaders either in jail or in exile. So it didn't really So if I fast forward to the beginning of the protest in 2010, it didn't even have the network in place to play a role mobilize. It was a professional organization like the Bar Association and the National Union that played a much bigger role than the Islamic sector, because the Islamic sector had been crushed for the past 10 years. Egypt is different. I would say that whereas at the beginning, in January 25th, the Muslim Brotherhood did not take part as far as I'm concerned, but they did join in afterwards. And I think their joining in did help. I wouldn't go farther than that. I wouldn't put them as the causal factor, but I would think that they did play a role. And in general, Islamic sector has played a role in developing civil society. Now, a place where civil society has developed also through the work of Islamic sector organizations is Gaza. And I don't have time to get into this, but if you're interested, there is last year, I believe, a very good book written by Dr. Sarah Roy about the fostering of civil society through the growth and of the Islamic sector within Gaza. And that would be a very fascinating reading to actually see how it works, not just to provide social and political goods, but also to create citizens' empowerment. And our focus is precisely the 90s. Yeah.
Thank you. The next question comes from Vedat. Vedat, you're now unmuted.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
So far, so good.
Okay. How do you classify the first step of the movements in Arab Spring as a first action to change the current situation in the country, or as a reaction against the political regime?
I think, for example, I see what you mean. I think it evolved pretty fast. I mean, if we think about the first steps of the mobilization, again, if I go to Tunisia, it had a lot to do with corruption, a lot to do with police brutality, a lot to do with deeper socioeconomic grievances, and a lot to do, in my opinion, with the sense of a perception of a completely unfair treatment in this kind of duality between the center of the country and the periphery that was kind of left behind. So I think it's fair to say that it started with a very strong economic component, built on very strong economic grievances. But this time there were very similar. There were other types of similar type of mobilizations, socioeconomic mobilizations in 2008 and 2010 in Tunisia, and more or less the other part, the same part of the country. But what changed then is that in this case, very early on, it became political. It became very early on about the regime having to respond for what was happening. It became very early on call to wide political change. So this was different from the previous type of mobilization, because it very quickly escalated into political. It was different also for other reasons. One of the main reasons why it was different is because the unions this time didn't stay on the side. They intervened directly, and we're talking about a very powerful union with more than 500,000 members. So that once they switched from being the mediator to calling for the regime change, there was a very big empowerment of the protest movement. But I would think they built on something that was very real. Socioeconomic grievances and inequality was already there, but unlike the other cycles, like the cycles I was telling you before at the beginning of the presentation, this cycle went political very quickly.
Thank you. Next question is from Adam. Adam says, Mushi alone said today that both the Arab Spring and the Islamic winter are misnomers. So from your point of view, what is the best way to describe the events of the past 2 years? And just as an addition to that, what role did the mobilization and building of civil society in the 80s and 90s play in the last 2 years?
Okay. Well, my point is that without the 2 previous decades of mobilization, you wouldn't have had a civil society that was able to come together and to mobilize that quickly, because they already had at least 2 decades of experience, or at least 2 decades of challenging even not frontally, but of challenging the main narrative and the main authoritarianism of the state. In terms of how to characterize the Arab awakening, Arab Spring, I mean, I personally think the term Arab awakening is a term that is pretty much on point, because unlike Spring, which basically underpins that the outcome will be positive, Arab awakening is basically describing the fact that there is a massive rise in social mobilization, people taking the streets, tearing down the wall of fears, demanding justice, demanding freedom, and that's factually what happened. Whereas when you say Arab Spring, it kind of implies that the outcome will necessarily be rosy. And that's something that it's hard to know because we're in the middle of a process, I would argue. I also think Islamist winter is a mischaracterization for the same reason. We are just in the middle of the process. And I think it would be unfair to expect a country that undergoes such a big revolution, such a swiping change, to get its house in order and become a democracy overnight. I think post-conflict, post-revolutionary transition periods are extremely difficult. They're extremely prone to challenges. If we take classic political science theory, we know that this democratization, post-conflict, post-transition period is the shakiest, the hardest, the most sensitive, the most conflict-prone we have in nation building. So I'm not so surprised that it hasn't been a breeze post the mobilizations. However, I would caution against any type of deterministic prediction of where we will be. I think it's early to know. There are societies figuring out what's next, and it doesn't necessarily mean that it will be painless or quick. But I think it's probably a bit too early either to be over optimistic, but it's also too early to give up on it. Yeah.
Okay, we still have a number of questions left. This one comes from Rosalie, who's looking at these mobilizations. She's wondering if they may be also tied to the impact of some of the facets of globalization, whether it's economic, social, technological, or also due to similar mobilizations happening in other areas around the world, in Latin America and other places, and particularly the post-Cold War movements, sort of socialist or Marxist movements. Would you see these Middle Eastern movement mobilizations as a similar example to this?
Not similar examples in terms of the social underpinnings, but if I look at the context, yeah, I see that there's I see similarities, and when I mentioned this a little bit before when I talk about you have a rise of social and economic mobilizations and activism in parallel with this mismanaged external imposed processes of liberalization and privatization. So that's where the example of structural adjustment programs in Latin America and the Middle East in a way kicks in, because there is in a way a context that has a lot of similarities with an externally driven process, that it's not well managed within, that it's not matched by strong social guarantees, results in societies having a very broad swiping and fast-paced change. The results not only in economic development, but in a type of economic development that is characterized by rising social inequalities and unemployment and creation of the second-class citizenships. And I think that the context is similar. I think that context is something that we can really we can find many similarities in the ideology used by the protesters and in other types of social underpinnings that I would make differences between, for example, Latin America and the Middle East. But the neoliberal framework is there. I think it's very important.
Our next question is from Rick, who asks, imagine a balanced number of men and women represented in this process. Do you see a different outcome from the traditional sort of mostly male model?
Well, in a way, this is something that is quite unexpected. But if we look at the number of civil society NGOs and groups in the 90s in this part of the world, we actually see that women's groups play a very big role they play, they're one, together with cultural association, women's group are one of the defining features. Granted, they are mostly urban, mostly middle class, mostly secular women, so they don't really represent the entire society. Granted, they have sometimes much better relationship with organizations in the West than with organizations in their own society. But they are, so I know all this and I'm making all these caveats, but even so, it would be a mistake to characterize civil society in the 90s in the Middle East as only male, meaning that a large chunk of the organizations were actually women's group, and what they were doing was equality, development. You could basically see, you would see 7 main types of groups: service, welfare groups, doing delivering social services to women, professional organizations of women, research centers led and organized by women, human rights centers, women human rights centers, development organizations focused on women's development, women's organizations of women's sections of political parties, and smaller types of grassroots workers, women's groups. So you did have them. With that said, so I think it's somewhat a mischaracterization to see the society as civil society as just male. However, in the public arena, then of course is more. Then of course the male presence is far more visible. But it doesn't mean that women's groups are not active there. For what it concerns later on in the Arab Spring, actually I would say that women played a very big role in the protest. And one of the unfortunate outcomes so far is it doesn't seem that it seems that following the revolutions, their presence was downsized, which is my doing. So although they did play a role in the revolutions, it seemed that after the revolution, women's rights are not doing so well. So that's definitely one of the concerning trends, I would say.
Okay, I think we have time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions. This one comes from Salwa, who, hitting on your point of different forms of civil society in the region, Salwa was wondering if there were any other movements that you had looked at, such as the Shiites in Iraq or Syria, or even in Egypt, there's a quite effective Coptic movement. So are there any other forms of this that you've studied?
Yeah, well, most of my work is on Lebanon, so I could speak a little bit more about Lebanon, but I think the examples raised are very interesting because, again, it's civil society groups that build upon pre-existing other sort of pre-existing identities like sectarian, religious, and what have not. And that's definitely played a role. I haven't looked so much into Coptic activism in Egypt, so I can't talk too much about that. I have looked at Syria quite a bit, and I've looked more specifically at yes, some specific movements, but for my 1 minute reply, I would rather say I looked at the fact that even in Syria, where we're now in the midst of a very bloody civil war, if I looked at the beginning of the mobilizations in Syria back in 2011, I actually saw a lot of civil society mobilizations back then. I saw a lot of political mobilization calling for reforms, addressing inequality, a lot of mobilizations that were not just employing strategic nonviolence, but also really to the core, sort of against one of the myths of Syria. They weren't only sectarian. I saw a movement that was more built around this common political idea of reform than just pre-existing sectarian identities. And I think that's very, very interesting, for example, because it contradicts the narrative on Syria as sort of just sectarian dynamics. I think it didn't start that way. However, I think that the governments made it very, employed a strategy to try to divide and rule as much as possible and to sort of enhance these sectarian divisions. And now I pretty much think we're in a sectarian dynamic, but it didn't start like that. It started like mass political nonviolent movements. So that's a case that I've looked a little bit about. I don't think I have time to talk about it, but yes, I've looked at Syria and Lebanon mostly. Yeah. I'm trying not to go too much over time with the answers.
Yeah, exactly. We actually we just have to sort of wrap up now. We just reached the hour point. So thank you so much for presenting. Were there any other closing remarks or any final points you wanted to make before we finish?
I'll just say that, I mean, my point was my 2 steps was just about saying that you have to dig deeper and see that actually there wasn't a dormant or inactive civil society at all. There was a civil society that may not look like what we define civil society in the West, but it was active, it was empowered, and it was trying to challenge the reality for a while before the Arab Spring. And that was my very simple point. And if there's any question that we didn't have time to address and you want to ask me, I'm very happy to answer by email. If I know it, I'll answer. So, and thank you for listening.
That's it. Benedetta, thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you for having me.
All right, thank you, everyone.